As most of you guys know, there are very few things that Moon Knight is actually afraid of, but there is one, and we're going to talk about it in this video. So, this is Moon Knight Fist of Khonshu Volume 2, The Subterranean Jungle, and this comes in the aftermath of the first volume that we covered, when Moon Knight basically had his backside handed to him quite readily by Achilles Fairchild, who was initially introduced as a drug kingpin in New York, only for us to find out that he was actually an Asgardian on Earth. And so after Moon Knight is so humbled here, he's not dead, but he is basically in a coma. And what ends up happening is his essence, right, his mind travels to meet Khonshu. Now, one of the things that I want to point out here, and this is an important distinction, for those of you guys who stopped reading Moon Knight before the events of Blood Hunt, you kind of remember that when it comes to Moon Knight, you only get resurrected so many times, and then you stay dead permanently. That's one of the things that Blood Hunt changed, was that Marc Spector was the Moon Knight of Khonshu. So Khonshu kind of undid that, right? He allowed Marc Spector to come back. And over the course of the story, it essentially establishes that Marc Spector can come back any number of times, right? Just because of the fact that when people think of Moon Knight, they think of Mark. They don't think of Badir, who we'll talk about here in a second. But when he's talking to Khonshu, he basically tells him that while you are alive right now, you're not dead, that may be preferable. And Mark asks why, and Khonshu says, because every time I resurrect you, like all of my fists, you edge ever closer to full insanity and internment in my cold halls, and then I could choose another. But again, it's just kind of like, that's never going to happen, right? Is really sort of the undercurrent and Marvel's official stance on it all. And so Moon Knight kind of lashes out, right? Screw you, Khonshu. I do your work. I spill blood and break your bones in your name. I may not do it the way you want me to, but I do it well. And so that's when Khonshu asks the question, then why does your broken body lie at the feet of the Asgardian Fairchild? Now, this goes to how intelligent Fairchild is, because keep in mind, there's Achilles Fairchild, and then there's Carver, his henchman. We will learn her story here in a second, but she is about as deadly as it gets, right? And she could actually kill Marc Spector, all because of the sword Genar that she has, which we'll also learn about. But the genius of Fairchild comes into play when Carver wants to kill him, and Fairchild is like, no, we're not going to kill him. And she asks why, and he says, because every time Marc Spector dies, Khonshu brings him back. The key to permanently defeating him is to keep him in this coma, to keep him locked inside his own body, because if he's not dead, he never comes back. But in a coma, he can't do anything at all. We'll just keep him this way. It's a genius strategy if you're looking to keep him off the board. It shows how intelligent he is. So facing off against someone like Fairchild is not just facing off against the strength of an Asgardian, it's facing off against a tactical genius. And so switching back to Marc Spector and Khonshu, Mark being here in front of Khonshu, really being brought to Khonshu, is more, I wouldn't say him being chastised, but Khonshu basically saying, you're not operating the way that I would expect you to, at the height, right, at the level that I expect you to operate at. And he says, you are one of my two fists. Even in defiance of me, you have always acted in my name. But to be baited so, defeated so, and humbled so, you disgrace me. And Mark fires back because it's not something that he buys into. Right, he says, so what are you going to do about it? And he just responds, I was stupid and hurting, but I am not done. I have my duty, a sacred duty, sacred to you because I do your work, sacred to me because I protect my people. So, what are we going to do about it? It's effectively calling the bluff of Khonshu, where Khonshu almost presents himself as this guy who's kind of saying, because you've been humbled in the way that you have, I'm not entirely sure you're the best person to continue on as a Moon Knight, so maybe we should just kind of chill here for a little bit and let Badir, my other fist, deal with this entire thing. And Mark's whole response here is, no, right? At the end of the day, you need me out there as much as I want to be out there. So, what are we going to do? And that's where Khonshu just tells him, I have given your mission the location of your body. Your future rests in their hands. And that's exactly what happens, right? Keep in mind, Badir is the fist of Khonshu that we didn't know existed before. That in all this time in Marvel Comics, that when Marc Spector was running around, Badir was out there too. They only recently met during this run of Moon Knight from Jed MacKay. And so while Mark is still in a coma at the time that Badir and Tigra and the rest of the Midnight Mission rescue him, the conversation with Khonshu continues on, where there's this kind of commentary, right, where Marc Spector's like, Tigra is gonna want to kill me, because keep in mind, they're romantically connected to each other, but Tigra's one of these characters, and I kind of love the relationship between Tigra and Khonshu at this point. Tigra's one of these characters where she doesn't really care about your standing as a god, and it's really amazing right, when it works that way, because she's one of these people where when she talks to Khonshu, she'll talk to him like a regular person, right? She'll be like, where you going, old man, right? Like that kind of thing. She doesn't kind of, bend down to him as a god the way that he expects. And in fact, that's what he says. In response to Marc's statement about how Tigra's going to want to kill him, Khonshu's like, she will. She is rude. She does not understand the decorum required to speak with a god. And he says, you have that in common, which is true. It's one of the things that I've always loved about her relationship with Khonshu, or at least whenever she encounters him. And so in that moment, when he's brought to the Midnight Mission, the question's asked, can you bring Marc Spector back, right? Specifically, they ask Badir because he's a doctor. And he's like, yes, I can definitely bring him back, but it will require you bringing me a sarcophagus. And 8-Ball's just like, all the way down here. Right? They always got this guy doing busy work, but that's exactly what happens, right? At the end of the day, the sarcophagus is brought in, Badir does his work, and then Marc Spector re-emerges. And so in this moment, Marc putting his costume back on, there's a conversation, right, that he says, okay, Achilles Fairchild has taken almost everything from us because he's been smart, taking us apart piece by piece. I think it's time that we got smart and started taking pieces of our own. Because keep in mind, when Achilles Fairchild and Carver first made their move on Marc Spector, they attacked the House of Shadows, which technically has been renamed to the Midnight Mission. And so when Carver and Fairchild made their move, using the Sword of Gunnar, Carver destroyed the House of Shadows and took its soul. And so now Marc and them are without a home. That's what he's referencing here, right? Taking us apart piece by piece. Basically taking the house meant taking a member of the team. And so at that point, the question becomes, what do they do, right? What's the best way to strike at Achilles Fairchild? And so they have this meeting, this sort of coming together in this big powwow. And the whole purpose behind this meeting is to ask the question, where do they strike first? When it comes to Fairchild, do they go after him directly, or do they do something else? And this goes directly into the heart of Moon Knight and the Midnight Mission, which is, while he technically protects those who travel at night, the reality here is there's a much bigger threat, and that's glitter. It's the drug that Achilles Fairchild has been peddling. It's a psychoactive agent, and it goes after the central nervous system. It's highly addictive. Now, Marc Spector and his team don't really know the ins and outs of it. They haven't really studied it per se. In the here and now, it's just the addictive property and how fast it's spreading. So they need to deal with that before they deal with anything else. And it's just because of the fact that with glitter being so addictive, if they take out Fairchild, there's no one else to supply it anymore. And as you guys can imagine, when the supply of a drug runs out, the people on that drug will lose their minds. They'll go crazy and do anything to try to get some version of it, which means turning to other drugs, and it'll start spiraling out of control, and the city will start to destroy itself. So, taking out his base of power before going after him. And so from Moon Knight's perspective, they need to get a hold of Hank Pym, because if anyone can develop an antagonist agent that can basically function as a cure for glitter, it's Hank Pym. So what ends up happening is Marc Spector realizes that trying to get a hold of Pym is impossible. They have to lure him out. And the only way that they can do that is to go after his daughter, Nadia. But the reality is, Marc Spector himself cannot just attack Nadia. It'll seem weird, right? And Hank Pym will immediately know that there's something going on there and will kind of hold back because he knows that Marc wouldn't actually kill Nadia. And so what ends up happening is 8-Ball comes up with this idea. He's like, look, man, when I was a villain, we would just like attack people's friends and family looking for stuff. And that's what happens. Right? Like, Soldier dresses up as Deadpool. I love that. Reese dresses up as a character named Chalk. And I'm going to be honest, she has probably one of the best lines in the entire comic, because at the moment, it just is designed to look like a villain raid of a superhero. And so like when they bust in there, 8-Ball's just like, we're here for all your science. Give us all your science. And so when they go to attack, 8-Ball tells Reese, right, you have to say the words. And she was like, talk to the chalk, and like fires off this gun. And it's like, it's chalk o'clock. It's the most ridiculous thing. Nadia has no idea what's going on right now. She's like, what is this? Like, this is the most ridiculous attempt to attack me that I've ever seen. But at the end of the day, it works. Because of the fact that she's kind of being overwhelmed to a degree, Hank Pym shows up and sends a bullet through the head of Soldier, right? And then like that's when he appears and he says, justice is served. Now, are you going to leave my daughter alone, or are we going to decide who's next? Because my nanite bullet ants are a far more literal interpretation of the name than their natural counterparts, as I'm sure you've noticed. And that's when Moon Knight appears and just says, hi Hank, nice night. Now, the funny thing about this, it can go both ways. When it comes to Marc Spector, it can go both ways. Either it can be him going after Hank Pym's daughter, or it can be him working as a hero, and that's what Hank Pym doesn't know. And so when Moon Knight shows up here, he just says, "It's a ruse, Hank. You like ruses, right? I needed to talk to you, and here you are." And so he's just like, "You put Nadia in danger because I wouldn't pick up the phone." And he's like, "Nobody was in danger, except maybe 8-Ball." And so he just tells him, right, "I need your help. There is a new drug out there, and I need you to synthesize an antagonist agent." And Hank's response is like, "Are you crazy?" Right? I mean, well, of course you are. Like, of course you're a crazy guy. I forgot who I was talking to. But I have important work to do. Why would I help you with some street drug nonsense? And that's when Tigra shows up and says, "Because he's not asking you, I am." Now, this brings us into the relationship between Tigra and Hank Pym. Not the most important part of the story, but I have seen a lot of confusion about this, so let's clear this up. The long and short of the relationship between Tigra and Hank Pym is that while they did have a romantic connection at one point in time, and in fact they actually slept together, the son of Tigra, William Nelson, is not actually the son of Hank Pym. Instead, when Secret Invasion was going on, there was a Skrull named Critty Null who was tasked with invading Earth and replacing Hank Pym. The problem was that Critty Null started to develop compassion for humanity and wanted the invasion to end and wanted humanity to survive. The result was that Queen Varanki, who was leading the invasion, killed Critty Null and then cloned Critty Null, basically making her more obedient, and in turn sent her forward as Hank Pym. Critty Null ended up coming across Tigra, which is where you get the argument that Tigra is historically bisexual in Marvel, because while she did procreate with Hank Pym, it was a Skrull who was a woman pretending to be Hank Pym. But the result was that William was born. And so while all this takes place over the course of the Initiative storyline in Marvel as part of Secret Invasion, quite literally, Avengers the Initiative, it was like issue 30-something when you end up finding out that the DNA of Critty Null was not passed on to William. The only DNA that was passed on to William was the DNA of Hank Pym, which would make William the biological child of Hank. And while Hank knows about that, Tigra never told William. William has no idea that Hank Pym is his actual father, like the real Hank Pym is his father. He doesn't know that, at least not as far as I'm aware. But the romantic connection between the two is really what Tigra's hitting at when she talks about how she was so angry at the fact that Hank Pym didn't tell her that he had returned. She says, "You never contacted me. I was going to hurt you like you hurt me. But to see you like this, right? What have you gone through, Hank Pym?" And Hank's just like, "There was almost nothing left of me, Greer. My body destroyed, my very soul devoured. My mind was just an echo within Ultron's systems. With the power of the Allfather of Asgard, I reconstituted myself from that echo, body, mind, and even soul, but not without cost. I am a ghost, Greer. I have a mission, not a life. I cannot do any more for the people who loved me than haunt them." Now, what he's talking about here is a combination of the Ant-Man story from 2022, which this comic references, and Rage of Ultron. So Rage of Ultron, as some of you guys may know, is the story where Hank Pym and Ultron merged into a singular being. As that went on, Hank Pym basically started to lose himself, and the Ultron personality became the dominant personality. That went on for years. Marvel didn't resolve it for quite some time. The Ant-Man story in 2022 is when that gets resolved, when Zane, a version of Ant-Man from the future, goes into the past and grabs Hank Pym, Scott Lang, and Eric O'Grady, who's the forgotten Ant-Man within Marvel Comics, and then through their efforts end up defeating Ultron. Now, stories like Ultron Forever take place during that point in time when, like, Ultron basically takes out Odin, he takes over Asgard, he gets what's essentially the Odin Force or the Allfather Force, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of that story, Ultron's defeated, and that's what Hank is referencing, that he had used the last vestiges of his power to reconstitute himself, and that's how he's returned. And so that's when Tigra lashes out at Hank Pym's statement, right, where she says, "I am tired of the men in my life deciding what I should and should not know. You were gone, Hank. I told my son stories about his father, how he was smart and clever, and how those were two different things, how he was compassionate and driven, and kind and sometimes funny, but most of all, about how he was brave." And Hank Pym is actually shocked to learn that Tigra had told William about him. Because as far as Hank was concerned, he was just this hidden father figure off to the side, and William knew nothing about him. So his legacy continues on, his memory continues on in that way. And it's a very important thing for him, because now it doesn't really feel like he's being shunted away by the people who know him, that he matters to the people who know him, and especially to his son. And so what you end up getting is a meeting between Moon Knight and Hank, the current romantic partner of Tigra and the former romantic partner of Tigra. Because at that moment, Hank Pym says that was a crazy thing to do, threatening Nadia like that. And Marc tells him, that's the second time you've called me crazy. I have DID. You have bipolar disorder. I think we've both been called crazy enough for a lifetime. And so he just kind of acknowledges that Marc Spector loves Tigra. And he says, I do. And he says, listen, I know about William, about Critty, about the scroll. And Hank just tells him, you've got mental health issues and you've come back from the dead. You know the circumstances of William's birth. As someone who knows where I'm coming from, tell me honestly, am I doing a disservice to this child by entering his life? And Marc just says, no. And Hank asks him, right, how do you know for sure? And Marc just says, because I have a daughter. Her name is Beatrice, and I am not allowed to be a father to her because of what I've done and who I am. You have the chance to be a father to William, so here's my advice. Take it. And so with all that foundation out of the way, we go into the fight between Carver and Moon Knight. Now, this is a genius strategy by Marc, because remember, Carver has Gunnar, but we don't really know anything about it. But what we end up learning is that at one point, presumably during the events of the War of Realms, it doesn't really give us a reference point, but there haven't been very many instances where Roxxon Corporation have invaded any of the other realms across the Nine Realms, specifically Vanaheim. That happened during War of Realms. You end up finding out that Carver is part of Roxxon's corporate military, literally a private army, but she's also ex-Special Forces, and that in the middle of all of this, she's attacked by this monster out there in Vanaheim, and that's when the sword presents itself. In this moment of desperation, it says, you are dead, woman. And she doesn't know where the voice is coming from. And he just says, your name, dead woman. And that's when she identifies herself. And she says, I'm armed. Show yourself. And the sword just says, armed. Your little toy is nothing in the face of that creature. But I will show you myself. I am Gunnar, the hoarding blade. And I require a hand to wield me. Will you die here in Vanaheim, Corporal Carver, your bones joining those of the forgotten, or will you draw me and be truly armed? And that's exactly what she does. She draws the sword, takes it for herself, and that's when you find out that Marc Spector is essentially chained up to a degree, at least in the mindscape. There's a reason for that, we'll talk about that in a second. But the sword itself is actually talking to Marc in this moment and giving him the backstory of Carver and how the sword and Carver met. Because the sword says, I gave Carver what she wanted, revenge, and in return, all she had to do was continue to kill, to feed my appetite for souls, to add to my hoard, lest her own be forfeit. And so as Marc continues to talk to the sword within the mindscape, the conversation's fascinating because he starts to find out that the reason why Carver uses the sword is because she's basically under the influence of it, right? Like her soul is bound to it. If she stops using it, she will die. So she constantly has to kill and satisfy the sword's need. That's how she ended up in the service of Fairchild. And the reason why is because with Fairchild being an Asgardian, and because Vanaheim is part of the Nine Realms, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that when Fairchild came along and told Carver, if you do what I tell you to, I can help free you from the influence of the sword. It's a part of my mythos, so I can control it and manipulate it, that Carver chose to work for him. But Marc Spector asked the question, Fairchild's lying, isn't he? And the sword says, of course he is. I am a thing of power. Fairchild is Asgardian, but no god. There is nothing he can do to take what's mine. Such as Carver, such as you. Are you ready to see me, to see the truth of me? And Marc just says, show me. And the sword manifests its true form in the mindscape, which is this massive dragon. And he says, look, Moon Knight, look upon my majesty and look upon my hoard, of which you are the newest addition. And Marc just says, a dragon. Right? And the sword says, indeed, right? I was born in murder. When Ori the Mad, shame of Nidavellir, broke the still hot metal of my blade into the breast of a great sleeping worm to quench it. That soul was my first and has ever been my nature, a dragon's nature, to control and to hoard, souls instead of coin. But what have I for coin? And so when Marc asked the question, will you surrender to me, Gunnar? The question is, surrender, a poor jest. And so that's when Marc tells him the truth of what's going on. He says, I am a fist of Khonshu. I am a son to a collector of souls. When we first met, I sensed your nature as familiar as my father's, which is how I knew exactly how to push Carver. You believe me trapped, but the trap was mine. Others have tried to take my mind, but my mind is poison fruit, and my soul, that was bought and paid for long ago. So literally, the sword is trying to take the soul of Marc, and he can't, because there is a person that has a greater power than Gunnar who has the soul of Marc, and that is Khonshu. That's the trap that was laid. Marc needed the sword, but the only way to get the sword was to enter into the mindscape and get the sword to try to take the soul of Marc, because in doing so, it would invoke the wrath of Khonshu, who shows up here, right, and pissed off over the fact that someone's trying to lay claim to what already belongs to his. And because Khonshu is drastically more powerful than the soul and the sword, that he goes to kill him. And that's when Marc says, "Father, spare him, for I have use for him." And Khonshu's just kind of like, really? Right? A use for this creature, my son, this creature who has so offended me. And Marc says, "Yes, Father, I am your knight, and a knight requires a sword." And so in that moment, you end up finding out that the whole reason this conversation even took place in the first place is because in the fight between Marc and Carver, Carver had stabbed him, and that's how Marc was able to access the mindscape and communicate with the sword. And so in taking the sword out, he's supposed to be dead, and Carver's shocked by the fact that he's not. And that's when Marc just tells him, "Your sword works for me now. I have done the one thing that Fairchild couldn't do. I freed you from your curse. The curse is now mine, but you are now mine. So what you're going to do is you're going to tell me everything I need to know about Fairchild and everything I need to know about how to kill this guy." It's genius strategy on behalf of Marc. And so what ends up happening is that Hank Pym ends up developing his cure. But when he does, it's basically composed of kibbins, right? Which is the root basis behind Mysterium. He does explain it to Marc Spector a little bit, but one of the things to know is that Mysterium is a material that is less durable than pure adamantium, but more durable than secondary adamantium. But Mysterium itself is an incredibly powerful material when it comes to magic. In fact, by all standards of measurement, through a combination of Guardians of the Galaxy stories, the Doctor Strange stories, the whole nine yards, it's been shown that it can actually cut off Doctor Strange's access to magic if he's stabbed with it, that it can overcome magical spells. Spider-Man's spider sense doesn't work on it, so it's an incredibly powerful material in its own right. But kibbins themselves are effectively Pym particles, so the very foundation behind Mysterium as it was created in Marvel from the Sword Strike team during the whole Krakoa era was by using Pym particles, because Pym particles themselves are based on the fundamental structure of matter in relation to its ability to change size. So that's one of the reasons why people say that the Pym particles are Hank Pym's way of altering reality, even on a basic level. But I simply say all that to say, Hank Pym's cure for glitter is basically anti-magic. That's really all it is. I just kind of felt like some explanation was needed for why it was anti-magic. And so when Marc takes this back to the Midnight Mission, that's when he says, "We have to rework our strategy. I know we were going to go after glitter first, and then we were going to go after Fairchild, but the reality is, because we can't mass produce this, we have to stop the supply of it, which also means stopping Fairchild, and then we can in turn go after those who are addicted to glitter." The problem with this is that it requires someone to take this substance. And that's when Marc basically volunteers himself. And initially Tiger's just kind of like, no, give it to Frasier, right? She's the cop that we have, the one that originally got us caught up in all of this, where we learned about everything going on with Fairchild. They thought she was a source of information initially, but she really wasn't. She could give them a little bit of info on what was going on, but her addiction to glitter is what really led them down the path of glitter being the dangerous substance that it is. But Marc says, no, right? If we give it to her, she might die. I'm a fist of Khonshu. I can always come back. Now, this is a very different form of Marc Spector from the way he used to be, because back in the 80s, Marc would have just like walked up to Frasier and just been like, "Take this," and just injected it in her. And then she's like, "Oh my God, like, is this going to kill me?" He'd be like, "Well, we'll find out." And like, that would be it. Like, Marc Spector was a dick back in like the 80s and especially the 90s and the 2000s, right? It was crazy the way his character was done. But he does exactly that. He takes it after taking glitter. Glitter drives him into like this maddened state, right? It's almost like a warrior's madness from Thor or a berserker state from Wolverine. But in taking glitter, because of the fact that it attacks the central nervous system and it's a hallucinogen, it starts to bring out some of his worst fears. But notice this, Marc's worst fear is not that he would kill someone he loves. His worst fear is not that he would fly off the handle. His worst fear is that he wants to. That's his darkest fear. Because you get this really amazing monologue as these kind of hallucinations start shifting through all these people, where they say, you thought it would be awful clever, awful noble, put yourself through the ringer, but you knew deep down that it was not going to be so simple, didn't you? Glitter is a central nervous system stimulant bonded to a substrate of exotic matter. That's what your egghead pal told you. And that brain of yours is not exactly stock, is it? Not after years and years of a god sticking his fingers in it. You knew the cure was going to hit you harder than some civilian, didn't you? But you just can't turn down the pain, can you? Of course, you never could. You've always thrived on it. You told Fairchild that violence was your vice, but that was not quite it, was it? It's pain. It's why you've been Moon Knight for so long. It's why you sabotage every good thing in your life to ensure that you will always get your fix. That would have to be it. What other explanation is there? And the guilt is almost as good as the pain, isn't it? The guilt of not telling your little friends, your little werewoman, that the only reason you brought them into your life is to eventually drive them away when the hunger pangs get too bad, when you need to feed yet more pain into that yawning hole at the core of you. This is not a theory, mind you. It's a fact. After all, this is not the first time that you've done this, and why shouldn't you? And so that's when Zodiac appears, arguably the greatest enemy of Moon Knight and his archenemy in the here and now. And Zodiac says, I've got to say, Mark, I am very into what you're becoming, letting the wild dog off the chain to go after vermin, going after Fairchild with murder in your eyes and blood on your breath, kidnapping cops, taking drugs. It feels good, doesn't it? The irresponsibility, the recklessness, the sheer unabridged savagery. Why, maybe you didn't need me after all. And where Mark initially denies the need for Zodiac, Zodiac says, when's the last time you went to therapy, Mark? Sure, you said you'd keep going after the Avengers took their boot off your neck, but you just keep stacking your excuses. Because you did have a breakthrough, didn't you? You figured it out. You realized that you didn't want to be better, not when you could be worse. Not when you let the wild dog call the shots, not when you could revel in the violence, not when you could wallow in the blood. This is not a psychic attack, Mark. You use your brain damage as a weapon. You cannot tag Khonshu in to fight for you on this one. Jake and Steven cannot help you here. No, this is all you. So look us in the face and see what you really are, which is an argument that he is all of his villains, the worst version of himself. It's the thing he fears most, that he wants his life to be bad, that he wants his life to be terrible. He wants it to fall apart at the seams. It's the only way he knows to live his life. And so in the aftermath of all of this, right, basically going through detox and knowing that the cure works, he goes into Fraser, tosses it to her and says, here, right, take this thing. This thing will work and it'll get you off that drug. It'll allow you to kick it. And so knowing that, they can start synthesizing it even on some measure of a base level. But Fraser asks, how do you know this is going to work? And Mark just says, because you're not the only one to take it, right? I'm the first one to take it and I know it works. And so she just asks, can you take Fairchild down? And Mark says, I flipped Carver. I beat her magic sword. I got a cure for glitter addiction. If I did all of that, do you think there's anything I cannot do if it means destroying Achilles Fairchild? And so at that point, you switch over to Fairchild himself, who gets a call from Marc Spector after he's been trying to call Carver, who's no longer in his service and doesn't have to deal with him anymore. And so when he picks up the phone from Mark, he just says, I have not heard from you since I laid that beating on you. It made me worried you forgot all about me, and it hurt my feelings, right? And Mark just says, look out the window towards Jersey. And Fairchild asks, what am I supposed to see, Mr. Knight? And he says, you'll see me, Fairchild. You'll see my work at the distribution center. We're on our way. Expect us. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.